Hey, Jericho.
Hey Alex, how are you?
I'm doing great. Doing great. Looking forward to this conversation.
Me too. I mean, it's one that is incredibly timely. So I just want to welcome the folks that are rolling in. Please let us know where you are dialing in from, and we'll get the conversation started shortly. I think I see our other guest.
Wonderful. Hey, Sam.
Hey,
Mhm. Hey Sam,
how's it going?
pretty good. I mean, we're happy to have you on with us this evening.
Absolutely, it's good to be on.
Excellent.
Um,
Excellent.
so as I said before, for those of you who are joining us, please drop a note in the comments. We want this to be an interactive conversation. If you have questions for Sam or Alex, or you want to lift anything up, please do that. Um, so thank you all for joining us for tonight's Justice Now conversation sponsored by the National Urban League. I'm your host, Jerica Richardson, and I serve as the Senior Vice President for Equitable Justice and Strategic Initiatives at the League. Um, and I want to take a step back because we know this month marks the 11th year anniversary since the tragic death of Trayvon Martin. And we know it was a death that really shocked the conscience of America, but also impacted the way we discuss racial inequality, justice issues internationally. And so, following the death of Trayvon, sadly, we've experienced countless murders and deaths of people of color across this country. All we need to do is think about Michael Brown and Eric Garner and George Floyd and Alton Sterling and Breonna Taylor. Sadly, the list goes on and on. But tonight, I really want to focus on not only where we've been, but talk a lot about where we are going. And really, I want to focus in because these tragedies I know impacted my generation and so many of you that have joined us for this conversation. So we want to focus in on the digital revolution that is occurring in grassroots organizing in this country. And I feel privileged to be joined by two amazing individuals that are doing great work in this space. First, I will introduce Sam Sinyangwe. Did I get it right, Sam?
You did.
Sam, thank you so much for joining us. And I really want folks to hear a little bit about your background because not only are you part of this digital revolution, but you wear many hats, and I think it's important to lift them up and share them with those who have joined us. So Sam is the founder of We the Protesters, co-founder of the Resistance Manual, and creator of the Mapping Police Violence and Police Scorecard databases. Now, these are tools that the National Urban League is blessed to use, and it really has informed so much of our work. And on top of all of that, Sam is also the co-founder of Campaign Zero, a research-based platform launched to move to an understanding of public safety that's beyond policing and advocate for better data-driven policy solutions to police violence. So Sam, welcome. Thank you for joining us. I know we're going to want to hear a lot more about your work as we go throughout the conversation.
Thanks for having me on.
And this conversation would not be complete if we did not have on my partner in this work at the National Urban League, Alexander Reyes. Alex is the Vice President for Equitable Justice and has a wide variety of experience in both the public sector, in law enforcement, in policy and civic engagement. And so Alex, I look forward to having you join in this conversation and just kind of sharing your wide skills and talents as we talk about where we're going in this new digital revolution.
Wonderful.
So let's jump right in, y'all. I want to
Yes,
talk
please.
a little bit about, we talked about the legacy of Trayvon Martin, but Sam, I wanted to come to you and kind of hear from you about what inspired you to get into this work and to apply your technical skills to the movement for justice.
Yeah. So I grew up in Orlando, Florida, not far from where Trayvon Martin was murdered. And growing up, it was for me more of a personal experience working my way through an incredibly segregated and unjust school system. And not really understanding, what was going on. I didn't understand that my individual story and the story of so many individuals who look like me, actually, when you add all of that together, you can understand some of the systems at work and how, it wasn't just me being, targeted or, threatened with suspension in school. It was actually, black and brown kids being pushed out of school. There was a broader system at work that I didn't understand growing up. I wanted to learn about and be a part of changing those systems. And so I went on to study political science. I got deeper into data and research methodologies to better understand how do we use data to unpack some of these systems and how they are treating or mistreating people, and use that data as a tool for pushing for change. So I started working at a research organization called PolicyLink in Oakland. And I was working there at the time when Trayvon Martin was murdered, George Zimmerman acquitted, and then ultimately when Mike Brown was murdered in Ferguson on August 9th of 2014. And the ensuing protests and national conversation around police violence, really that kicked off at that time. I was shocked, honestly shocked, doing work as a researcher in sort of the educational space where I was focusing on getting data, looking at data on school to pipeline, school push, and seeing the incredible amount of data that was being collected in that space. Virtually every school in America reports data on the number of students that are suspended, in school, out of school suspension, who's being referred to law enforcement, who's arrested at school, disaggregated by race, disaggregated by gender, disability status. All of that data is available in the education space. Then, in 2014, early 2015, as this national conversation around police violence really kicked off, it became clear very, very soon that there was not that rigor of data and research that was being applied to the issue of police violence that I was already familiar with in the space of education. And that without that data, so many organizers and activists were running up against a wall where researchers and policymakers were trying to dismiss our lived experiences by saying, well, where's the data to prove that the police are discriminating? Where's the data to prove that Black people are more likely to be harmed by police or more likely to be killed or shot? And so that's the data really that I started collecting, compiling the information from local media reports, existing crowdsourced databases like Killed by Police at the time, and pulling all of that together into what's now the most comprehensive database of people who've been killed by police in the country at mappingpoliceviolence.us, and then expanding that analysis to better understand non-fatal forms of police violence. We know that for every person who is killed by police, there are at least one other person who is shot and survives, and that there are about 100,000 people who are hospitalized in a given year due to police use of force. So my work really has been starting off understanding the power that data can have in moving the conversation forward and getting us past some of these narratives that the police and other policymakers use to prevent change from happening. And taking that, building out data, and working with organizers and activists and organizations across the country to use that data to make an impact. And so we're doing.
Well, thank you, Sam. And it's so important, your work, because people are quick to dismiss our personal experiences and the stories that happen and occur in our community. So you're making it very crystal clear and concrete for folks. I would ask you, if you wouldn't mind, dropping some information about your resources into the comment section, because I want folks to leave this conversation and be able to access them going forward. Alex, I mean, it's hard to have this conversation without talking about our own experiences I would love for you to share what drew you to this social justice space and work.
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. And Sam, I'm always so moved by hearing your journey and how you equated or pulled together the need for action and for answers with connecting that to data and data points that help us to uh, uh, force the narrative, right? And to claim the narrative with data and information. So I get goosebumps every time I hear it. But enough about you. A little bit about me. So I got into this work um, mainly and primarily because I grew up in a public service minded family. Right. My parents are both healthcare professionals. My grandfathers were both military servicemen, and my grandmothers were stanchions in the community where the community looked to them. I grew up knowing that, if not you, then who? If not now, then when? That saying that the late great honorable John Lewis made famous. That's a saying that I grew up knowing very well. But there are two specific points or moments in my life that I can point directly to how I got into this space. The first of which was when I was violently stopped and frisked by plainclothes officers who drove their unmarked vehicle onto the sidewalk to block my way as I walked to the bodega in Jamaica, Queens. When those two officers, who I found out were officers, when they jumped out, I thought that they were jumping me, to be honest. And the way that they treated me, the way they spoke to me, and essentially at the end of it left me there with no answers and plenty of questions, that sort of lit a fire under me to solve those problems, because I knew that this was a sick rite of passage for people who look like me, my brother, my father, my cousins, my uncles, and the people and young men and young women who look like me going forward would have to face that reality unless we addressed it. A second incident occurred when I was disenfranchised at the voter polls, right, where I recognized firsthand how unjustly and surprisingly, without any recourse, someone can be purged from the voter polls without any notice. And so that also lit a fire up under me to get engaged in the civic engagement access space. And so with both of those spaces together, I've leveraged data and evidence-based resources in order to put the narrative forward to educate our arguments for change.
Thank you for that, Alex. I'd love for you both to talk a little bit more about how you personally see the conversation regarding police violence changing with the introduction of this data. I mean, Sam, you really filled a void. I remember as a journalist and trying to cover issues that were happening in our community, and there was no great resource or database with this information. And how can we tell a story, and how can we actually give an accurate picture of what's happening if we aren't aggregating that information? So talk to me a little bit about how this work you think has changed the conversation. And let's talk about some of the wins, because I don't think we talk about that and cover that as much. Has the data, has being able to pinpoint these things led to maybe some more favorable outcomes for people in the criminal justice system when we're talking about police accountability and other issues?
So there are a couple of major ways in which data has been a game changer in the space, and other ways data is not impactful maybe as we had hoped. I think in terms of being a game changer, data can really be powerful in moving the conversation to a point where we can get past some of the narratives that often leave us stuck trying to argue back and forth with policymakers or police chiefs. Sort of your word against their word. They're saying things are really dangerous and the police officers are in danger, and they're just going to communities where they're getting calls for service, and that's their narrative, that's their argument. And without data, it's very difficult to as an activist, as an organizer, as an everyday person to challenge that. Right. And so data has been really powerful. And I've seen examples of the data challenging those narratives and moving us to a different place. So I'll give you an example of my hometown, Orlando, Florida. And this was a couple of years ago. Met with it's no longer the police chief in Orlando, but was at the time, So one of the things that has been a recurring trend in the data, when you disaggregate, the data on killings by the police, like the most extreme form of police violence, there are about 1,100 to 1,200 people killed by police each year. Black people 3 times more likely than white people to be killed by police. But your likelihood of being killed by police varies dramatically depending on where you are, what city you're in, what state you're in, what police force you're up against. And Orlando has, year after year, had one of the highest rates of police violence in the country. Now, most people don't think about Orlando, Florida as like a hotspot for police violence, but the data suggests that it is. And so that's the data that I brought to the police chief at the time in Orlando. And so, had all of this data, could compare Orlando to all of these different cities. And it became clear very early on in that conversation that they already had a pre-existing sort of model or explanation or narrative that they applied to the situation that they've been telling themselves for a long time to try to justify this behavior as the police. And their narrative was that Orlando is different than other cities. They may have more use of force incidents when you just look at the raw numbers, but the police were arguing that Orlando is a uniquely rowdy place because there's so many tourists that come to Disney World and Universal, and all of those tourists congregate on Orange Avenue, which is like the central downtown corridor, and officers are encountering a really difficult situation, encountering tourists who are getting rowdy, drinking, and they're using a lot of force because they're in a dangerous situation. That was legitimately the narrative that the city of Orlando were to explain why Orlando has such a high rate of police violence. So I was able, because I had that data, I had the data not only at the level, but for every city. I could break that down and show that Orlando has a dramatically higher rate of police violence than New Orleans, than Las Vegas. And so I brought that conversation right then in real time. Right? I brought that chart in and I said, do you mean to tell me that your officers are encountering a more challenging environment than officers on Bourbon Street or the Las Vegas Strip? Like, why are your officers using dramatically more force in those situations? And at that point, the police chief sort of took a step back, realized that that narrative that he'd been telling himself and the media and everybody, no one really held water. And he said, I think you might be right. We need to talk about solutions. We might actually have a problem here. But without that data, it would have just been like me yelling at him yelling at me, him being the police chief. And so like, having that legitimacy that's offered that unfairly is given to the police, that could sign that argument. And so I think the data has been very essential in moments like that to really challenging some of the narratives that seek to justify. I think there are a range of other narratives that are widespread in the space that data has been a powerful tool in pushing back against. There are narratives around which communities are more likely to be impacted by police violence. We see in the data that Black people are 3 times more likely to be killed by police, and also more likely to be unarmed when killed by the police, less likely to be alleged to be threatening anybody. So we see that in the data, and that's important data that I have used and I've seen other people use effectively to push back against these narratives that the police are not discriminating or are not treating Black and brown people with higher rates of police violence. So I think in that way, I think data has been powerful in helping us move narratives. I think it's been a little bit more limited when it comes to pushing up against a sort of ingrained tendency not to support, I think, more far-reaching changes. I think that there is a hesitation, even given all of the data that shows that the existing system is causing a lot of harm. 100,000 people every single year hospitalized due to police use of force, entire communities traumatized and impacted by police violence. I think despite all of that data, we have not seen like the transformation changes that the data would suggest needs to happen. And so I think that's a limit. Like you can have the arguments, you can have the data. At the end of the day, there are policymakers in those positions that have to make hard decisions. And it takes more than just data to move them. It takes electoral organizing. It takes thinking about partisan politics and the ways in which those are often leveraged and deployed against any efforts to change policing. So I think there are a lot of other factors that have to go into this beyond just the data, but data is an essential tool to get there.
I agree, and I think that's a perfect segue into Alex. Alex works in the policy space and the advocacy space, and so when we're talking about data and being able to inform solutions or approaches to the work, I'd love, Alex, to hear a little bit from you, one, about really what's happening on the federal level. The National Urban League issued its 21 pillars for redefining public safety and restoring community trust back in 2021 with the help of our former colleague, Nani Anyakweli, who was a director of the team then. But there was a lot of advocacy focused on these transparency mechanisms, data and information sharing. And there was a bit of a pushback. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of that being part of how we pursue solutions, but also feel free to delve a little bit more into what Sam was saying about the partisanship and how it impacts how far we actually can go.
Absolutely. I want to start by saying, I firmly believe that data is what should drive policy, and the very data that Sam is talking about is what should drive policy. And there's so many limitations in the advocacy space that we come across where the generalities are consuming people's right frame of mind. But when you bring them the data, it brings a specificity to the instances and an ability to compare. And I think that is really the smart thing about making these tools so accessible. And what Sam described here, being able to compare Orlando to a Las Vegas and in literally Bourbon Street. I mean, come on. When you make those kinds of specific comparisons, you can't help but switch and shift the narrative. And that's what informs people at the end of the day. Now, I want to say one of the last times that me and Sam got together, it was during the development of the 21 pillars. And we were talking specifically about collecting data around police misuse of force. And if folks are looking at our 21 pillars for redefining public safety, Pillar 14 specifically demands the collection of police misconduct and use of force data. And I want to point out that the police scorecard notes that only 35% of the 16,000 police departments actually give their data. And so there's so much data that's missing in the conversation so that we don't have the information that can drive policy. And so we have to talk about that as an omission by public officials, by police departments that are keeping us from the data and the power and the information that we're entitled to. And so getting ourselves closer to a win on the federal level and more specifically on a state and local level to ensure that data is accessible is what will drive the legislative change. But until we get there, or to get there, to build that wave of information, we need to continue these narratives informing one another. I was just clicking through mappingpoliceviolence.org again, and just clicking through the different comparison modules that you can do, where they're comparing by race or comparing by location, and just being able to drill deep down. I can tell you that there have been so many instances. The National Urban League is a wide organization, right? We have 92 affiliates across 37 states. So oftentimes our state affiliates or our local affiliates are responding directly to these instances of police violence, and they're looking for data support. And whenever me and my team and Jerica are looking for the data, we know where to go. We know how to point to what has happened over the last year, 5 years, 10 years, because folks like Sam are putting that together at our fingertips, right? This is how you drive narrative. And I want to say that thanks to data like this, that police scorecard is .org has put at our fingertips, and mapping police violence, that has allowed us to inform the calls for pattern and practice investigations that we've done in this office, and it's informed our letters to local officials, whether they be police departments to fire folks or to redesign their systems, or to mayors and governors and senators. It's data like this that helps to change and shift the narrative, because at the end of the day, and I always say this is the most important thing that anybody should remember when you're thinking about policy advocacy, is that this work starts with people and it ends with people. We get lost in the numbers and the maps and the data, but at the end of the day, every data point is a life lost, a person maimed or hurt or felt threatened. I know that feeling personally, and so many of us do as well. And so that's why these data sources that Sam creates is so helpful to shifting the narrative away from generalities and into specificity.
That's such a great point, Alex. And I want to take a step back because I think I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about access and the challenge that so many folks in Black and Brown and other marginalized communities have to broadband service, technology in general. And so I want to, this question is to either of you or both of you, whoever wants to jump in. How can we ensure that not only our communities are informed, but well equipped to participate in this digital age? I think there's so much promise in the way we can approach organizing with data in this kind of digital revolution. But how do we make sure that we can have more folks get online and be a part of this revolution?
So I think the first lesson is to meet people where they're at. So often there are incredibly talented researchers studying incredibly important issues, and then at the end of all of that knowledge production, there's like a report that's issued or an academic paper that's like 50 pages long, incredibly dense, and very few people outside of a small, tight-knit community of professionals. And so that limits the impact that research can have. So part of it is, and part of the work that we do at Mapping Police Violence Organization is to take this data, compile the data, and do that with rigor, but also to share that data and make it accessible in a way that everyday people can understand it and can use it, that it's actionable. So you can break down that data for your city, you can break it down for your state, you can see how it affects people differentially by race in your city, in your state. You can see comparisons, over time and see if things are getting better or worse. So part of it is understanding the key questions that people are asking and producing data that can help them make sense of those questions in a way that is as accessible as possible. And a big part of it is also thinking about social media and how people consume information. So most people are getting their news like on their timeline on social media as they're scrolling up on their phone. They probably aren't going to see something for more than 2 or 3 seconds in that space that takes to scroll up their timeline. And so if you haven't taught them something and showed them something in those 2 to 3 seconds, whether that's the headline, whether that's a map, whether that's a data visualization or a graphic, you've missed 98% of your audience. Only 2% of people click on any tweet or any article, and that's like at best. So you're missing a whole host of folks who learn something if you don't package that information in a way that it is broadly accessible, actionable, and showing up on people's timelines where they're getting their news in the format that they. So I think that's a key lesson in the not only the collection of data, but how to produce that data, how to make it accessible, how to translate that into formats that can then be most actionable for as many people as possible.
And what I think that is the gem right there, is meeting people where they are. And all I will add to that is that are you willing to go to the desert with water if people are living in a digital desert? And this is how we reach people where they are when they can't even get access. What we saw during the heart of the pandemic, where folks were trying to learn from home or work from home, but did not have access to the digital resources that they needed in order to live and continue to get information and or to work. In 2021, the National Urban League released its Lewis Latimer plan addressing the digital divide. This year or late last year, the Biden administration announced that it was about $65 billion would be invested in broadband. And something I learned yesterday, hearing a talk by businessman and philanthropist Robert Brown, was that HBCUs, many of the HBCUs and other college campuses reside in digital deserts, and so they don't have the digital towers that bring the requisite level of Wi-Fi to be able to carry that many digital streams or services to all of the students. And so what we're facing in, if you're not living in a major city, if you're living in a suburb or in a rural area, or even an area that is lower income or devoid of so many of the other services that folks require, what you find is that folks don't even have the requisite access to be able to be reached. And so what we have to do is ensure, as these federal dollars get rolled out, that they go where they're intended to go. What we've seen over time and time again, over generations, is that when money flows from the federal government down to states, that it gets diverted into the coffers of folks who are already in power. We already have said and covered that information is power, and that power resides in that access to data, so that we can shift from generalities to specificity. But if those dollars don't get from the federal government to state governments, to the areas that are deserts, then we're going to be finding ourselves in this repetitive cycle of spending money without getting the requisite return, which is democratizing the power that is embedded within these tools that folks like Sam creates.
Talking about more tools, can we have a discussion about artificial intelligence? So I would love to hear from both of you about this. Because there are folks that might find themselves on one side or the other on this issue. But it is becoming embedded in our daily lives. So do you think this space, this type of technology is helpful to the movement, or do you think it can be harmful, or both?
I mean, it's a great question. I mean, it's a tool, right? Technology is a tool, like data is a tool. It depends who's wielding it and for what purpose. I think about, for example, some of the technology that they are using to fuel predictive policing. It's incredibly problematic across the country. Like, they are designing algorithms that incentivize officers even more so than the status quo to go into Black and brown communities and to make arrests on particular street corners. And that whole process, has been unpacked by researchers. It is biased, exacerbates disparities. At the same time, right, that is a technology that the police have decided to weaponize against our communities. But there are also researchers using that same technology to predict police violence and to predict which officers on which street corners will be engaged in that violence, and to put people on those corners with cameras to catch those officers. And I can't argue against that, right? Like, that is, like, flip the technology, use the tools. Like, it is a tool, and if we're not using it, it's getting used against us. So I don't think we should be leaving it on the table and sort of not going after AI, not delving into the potential applications of new technologies to service our purposes. But we ought to be aware of, conscious of, and also actively pushing against the use of those technologies against our own communities, because that's generally what happens.
Yeah, I would love to be able to echo that. You say it so so effortlessly, and I'm learning so much hearing from you. I've heard from folks who are both concerned and excited about AI and how more accessible it is. And I think folks should be reminded that AI is involved, has been involved for several years. Everything from autocorrect to your spam filters and things like that. So AI has been embedded in your hands and in your pockets or on your devices. But what I think the shift now is that it's democratized so that you can actually use plain language to tell the computer to do something instead of having to code it yourself. And I think that is where the power and some of the detriment is, because it really does depend on who has the power in their hands. Like Sam said, I think that the predictive power of being able to counter organize or counter what we know are ill effects of police violence or other state-sanctioned violence against people, being able to use that on the ground level with the people is an important point of access. And I'd love to be able to see our folks experimenting, exploring how to do that more, while limiting some of the privacy dangers and other things that could be embedded within the technology. But I think that that's where the power lies. And I will want to reiterate that folks need to have access to the broadband lines to be able to access the power of this shift in technology. And so, if we're going to democratize AI, we definitely need to ensure the democratization of and commodity making broadband accessible to everyone everywhere.
Well, I'll say after all of that, I think the jury's still out. You guys have made a lot of arguments for it. I'm all for it, for risk management. When we've seen officers time and time again have problematic histories, it's kind of hard to not look at that. But then we also do have to be conscious of racial profiling that can happen. But very interesting point. And I do want to be conscious of our time and really give you each an opportunity to talk about what's next. Sam, I know you have inspired so many people, and there's so many other folks that have come into this work and into this movement through data, through technology, through social media, and some non-traditional means. And I think it's awesome how many diversely skilled individuals are now able to engage in this work in a way that hasn't been done before. So I'd love to hear from you what's next. And then Alex, I want to turn to you to close us out. We know there's always so many things happening at the League, but would love to hear from you your thoughts on what's next in this space. Sam?
Yeah, so I think, just to preface this, we know a lot more than we did back in 2014 and 15 conversation, really started off in earnest. And we know a lot more than we knew back in 2012, right? And so part of it is, understanding that we have enough data now to start making some real decisions, right? And there is a tendency to say, if we only had more data, we just need to collect more data. But while we're doing that, there are folks who are being harmed every single day. There are folks who are losing their lives every single day due to this issue. There's an extreme urgency to take all the knowledge that has been produced so far and apply it right now where it can be applied. And so there are a couple of things that we know, right, based on the data so far. One, that nationwide, we're not seeing a reduction in deadly police violence. And we're also not seeing a reduction, according to available data, in non-fatal police violence either. So things aren't moving in the right direction. We also know that there are particular states and cities that have seen some reductions, and that those places tend to be places that have reduced police enforcement, particularly for low-level offenses. So we see a number of campaigns trying to get police out of the business of traffic enforcement, trying to get police out of the business of arresting people for drug possession, arresting people for issues that are often associated with poverty and homelessness, like trespassing, disorderly conduct, those open container laws, et cetera. The places that have moved the most in that direction over the past decade have seen the largest reduction in police shootings. And so that suggests, and have also not seen a differential increase in crime, right? That's the narrative the police will say. If you stop enforcing these things, crime's going to get out of control. That's not what we're seeing. We have enough data to say that. And so we need to use that data to push in that direction, because right now we're seeing a huge counter mobilization against doing anything like that, right? We're seeing a counter mobilization that is trying to fearmonger around crime rates in order to put back in place some of the policies that created this problem, right? We see units being created, right? Special enforcement units being either reestablished, like in New York City, or in Memphis with Tyree Nichols. We see particular crimes being created based on this fearmonger that are actually causing a lot of harm. And we need to push back against that, right? So I think the most urgent thing in the near term is to take the data that suggests that the direction that organizers have been pushing in to remove the police from low-level enforcement, to create alternative first responder programs for mental health, to create and invest in communities, to address underlying social determinants of inequity. That's the direction we need to go in. And so I'm hopeful that like in this moment, there are a lot of states that are right now in session, legislative session. There are bills being considered right now. In California, there's SB 50, the police from the enforcement of equipment violations and other low-level traffic violations. There's similar legislation being considered in other states as well. And so, this is something that most urgently in the near future, we need to be pushing on and getting those bills signed into law, so that ultimately they can continue to reduce police contact that often escalates into use of force or deadly force. I think over the long term, right, there's a much bigger need for research into those available alternatives. I think we can say with the available data that like the police are causing a lot of harm, and we can quantify that harm to some extent, in response to traffic enforcement or, in response to domestic disturbances or particular situations. We have the most granular detail that allows us to say that. But what we don't have is really good data on the alternatives. So mental health first responder programs are being piloted in cities across the country. Many of them are only a year or two old. Some of them have started releasing data, but most have not. And so the available data from those programs, it looks promising. But I think we need to have more study on which programs in particular, what combination of programs are most effective. What do you do in call types where, so right now in many of those programs, they don't send a mental health first responder if the person has threatened to harm somebody else or if the person is armed. And so that makes we need to figure out a response to those situations, because there are a whole host of those situations in which people lose their lives every single year that the traditional programs that are being created right now are not set up to respond to it, or not authorized to respond to. So I think there's a lot more research that needs to be done into the emerging alternatives in traffic enforcement, in mental health first response, and into response to a whole host of low-level nonviolent issues that the police are currently responding to in a way that actually makes things worse and not better.
Wow,
Yeah,
Sam. I'm going to jump in.
mic drop.
Much props, because you shared so many things that I think we really aim to cover in our 21 pillars for redefining public safety and restoring community trust, which because of the internet, because of data, because of just being able to connect with technology and information is quite frankly a living, breathing document. So Sam, that was beautiful. We need to take you on the road with us. I think we're heading to LA next. But what you said was so important. I think there are so many opportunities, not only in our work, but in the work of so many of our colleagues in the civil rights movement, to lift up these approaches. It's so important. We have to increase transparency. We have to share information about what's really happening, because in the absence of doing so, as you said, the narrative is changed and twisted, and fear-mongering happens, and we end up moving backwards instead of forward in the direction that we really need to go. Alex?
Yeah, I want to key in on the tipping point. I think we have reached a tipping point of data collection, and we know, frankly, we know what we didn't know. We know what we didn't know 20 years ago when my rights were infringed upon by the police. I know so much more now that we've done the studying, we've collected the data, and the very alternatives, the non-police alternatives, the community response alternatives that Sam has alluded to, are the creation of that tipping point. Right, we have gotten the data that supports the need for these alternatives, and that's why these programs are available. What we need to do now is normalize the collection and reporting of this data so that we can learn more. This is a learning process. We are humans. This is what we do. This is essential to our life, and our future is learning from our past mistakes, learning from what we're doing in the present for the future. What I'd say for the National Urban League, we've leveraged data, and we're increasingly leveraging data across a wide spectrum of policy areas, including policing and police department accountability with our 21 pillars, which everybody should look into. Shout out to mapping police violence and police scorecard for for helping to inform that work across all 21 of those pillars. We're also leveraging data, obviously, in our Lewis Latimer, digital divide plan, which everybody should take a look at, because those $65 billion that are being doled out from the federal government to local communities or to states in order to build out broadband so that we have access. We built out a plan for that. We put together the data and the information and the studies that are necessary for folks on the ground to understand what is needed. And that's coming up soon. I think June is when that money starts to get doled out. I also want to say that the National Urban League is leveraging data, and we're trying to figure out new ways to leverage data in our civic engagement work, from the Reclaim Your Vote effort, which allows for folks to get access to their voter registration data in real time, allows people to get the information that they need about polling places and whether they have any holds on their registration status and the like. We're leveraging technology to bridge the gap of communicating in various different ways that people receive information, whether by voice or visually or by reading, helping folks with overcoming certain obstacles to comprehending information, whether it be literacy or audibility issues or colorblindness. There are so many ways that we need to address the access issues. And I want to say one more plug. One of the things that we're working on is gathering legislative data using new legislative tools in order to track the very, Sam, he rattled off several bills across the nation. We're working on tools with partners in order to help democratize that, to help the public and our affiliates across the country to access that information. And so this data is so important. This access is so important. And it's literally the fuel behind our movement going forward. And so what we need to do is access and tap into that power.
Well said. Look, I had such fun having this conversation with you both. It was such a rich conversation, and I hope those who have joined us enjoyed it as well. If you didn't know before, folks, the digital revolution is here. So we all need to get on board and tap in. There's so many ways that we all can engage and continue to move the ball forward as we fight for justice and equity in this country. Sam, Alex, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks to everyone who has tuned in. We look forward to the next conversation. Until then, remember, the time for justice is always now. Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.